Now, in the last video, we dealt with John chapter 5 and verse 1, which are one of the two fundamental pillars in John's Gospel and upon which the 3.5-year ministry understanding rested. And of course, then we showed how it had to be dismissed. So now let's turn to the other pillar, John chapter 6 and verse 4, which reads, "Now the Jewish feast of the Passover was near." Now this scripture is really important, and for two reasons. And so we're going to examine why. See, the first reason, this scripture is actually critical to any understanding that Jesus' ministry lasted for more than 2 years. And secondly, but more importantly, it determines whether Jesus was indeed the foretold Messiah. Now, let's dwell on that, please. That's how important this is. See, in his famous Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, recorded in Matthew 5 and verses 17 and 18, this is what Jesus, claimed. Where we read, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you truly, until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot, not a stroke of a pen will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Not a single jot or comma, as we would say in today's parlance. Well, let's consider that point. See, let's consider for a start the fundamental laws, or one of the fundamental laws that Jehovah God gave through Moses, gave the nation through Moses, for them to make opportunity to express their heartfelt gratitude to him for all that they had received, the land of the promise. And in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16, he makes something very clear to them. 3 times a year, all your men are to appear before the Lord your God in the place he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, the feast of weeks, and the feast of tabernacles. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Everyone must appear with a gift as he is able, according to the blessings the Lord your God has given you. This law applied to every male Jew over 20 years of age. Now, we have read John 6:4, a Passover festival, according to that verse. Every male Jew was required to attend the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which of course included the Passover meal, at the place God would choose where his name was to reside. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 5 and 6. You are not to sacrifice the Passover animal in any of the towns that the Lord your God is giving you. You must only offer the Passover sacrifice at the place the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling for his name. Where was that? Jerusalem. But we need to confirm that. 2 Chronicles chapter 6 and verses 5 and 6. Now this is Solomon speaking at the dedication of that first temple. And this is what we read. Since the day I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I have not chosen a city from any tribe of Israel in which to build a house so that my name would be there, nor have I chosen anyone to be ruler over my people Israel. But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to be over my people Israel. Well, that's pretty clear, is it not? So, turning back to John 6 and verse 4 again, and this time we read a little bit more closely and in context. Where was Jesus? Well, verse 1 informs us. After this, Jesus crossed to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. Now, if the Passover was near, as verse 4 states, then Jesus should have been, or at least thinking about heading towards where? Towards Jerusalem. However, what do we find Jesus doing? Let's take the next verse, verse 5. When Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where can we buy bread for these people to eat?" But he was asking this to test him, for he knew what he was about to do. Yeah, he was about to miraculously feed the crowd. And then after that, verses 16 and 17. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was already dark, and Jesus had not yet gone out to them. Still in Galilee. Then what? Verse 24 and 25. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum to look for him. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they asked him, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Still in Capernaum. Okay, let's go on. Verse 59. Jesus said this while teaching in the synagogue in Capernaum. He's still there in Galilee. Right? An argument may go something like this. Well, he could have made his way up to Jerusalem and got back. Okay? Let's move on to chapter 7 and verse 1. Remember now, no chapter and verse divisions in the manuscripts. So Jesus is still in Galilee according to the manuscripts. And guess what? The Feast of the Tabernacles is near. What does Jesus do? Well, let's look at chapter 7 and verses 8 and 9, where he says to his brothers, "Go up to the feast on your own. I'm not going up to this feast because my time has not yet come." Having said this, Jesus remained in Galilee, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, he also went, not publicly, but in secret. See, the scriptural account is quite clear, is it not? He was not going to miss the feast, if only by going up in secret. So, as there is no evidence that Jesus travelled to Jerusalem for the Passover of 6 and verse 4, because it's just not there, what are we to conclude? Well, you see, to account for this narrative, one of two scenarios must exist. Either Jesus did not go to Jerusalem for the Passover, or John 6 verse 4 is an insertion by scribes, as it so clearly breaks the entire narrative of chapter 6. And the question is, which is it? Well, let's examine manuscript evidence and see what we can discern. Now, you will recall that I did state that all known manuscripts does contain John 6 verse 4. Was I correct? Well, actually, no, not quite, as we shall see. There are some manuscripts that do not contain John 6 verse 4, leading some scholars to question its originality. A notable manuscript, for example, is Minuscule 472. Now, this is a 13th century manuscript currently housed in Lambeth Palace, London. Now, initially it was believed that this manuscript omitted John 6:4. However, further examination revealed that this verse is present, but marked with an obelisk, a dagger, a symbol used by scribes to indicate doubt about the authenticity of a passage. And so this suggests that while the scribe included the verse, they were aware of textual variations or controversies surrounding it. Now, there is another manuscript, Minuscule 1634. Now, this is a 14th century manuscript and is housed in the great Lavra monastery in Athos, Greece. It is noted for omitting John 6:4 entirely. Now, the absence of this verse in Minuscule 1634, it contributes to the argument that it may have been a later addition to the Gospel of John. There are a few early Syriac traditions which also skip this verse. They go from John chapter 6 and verse 3 to John chapter 6 and verse 5. But, there is some debate about those manuscripts. And there is an ongoing search, however, at this time for other earlier manuscripts where John 6:4 is either questioned or not there. Now, the current count is something like 19 manuscripts, and the search is still going on. And there's every confidence more are going to be found. However, the early church fathers, provide additional insights for us. For example, Irenaeus, now this is around 180 CE. He argued for a 3-year ministry of Jesus, citing the Passovers in John chapter 2, chapter 5, and chapter 12, but does not mention John chapter 6 and verse 4. Why would he cite John 5, which clearly does not state it was a Passover, simply a festival of the Jews, but ignore John chapter 6 and verse 4, which, if it was there, actually states it was a Passover? See, this indicates to me that there's a strong possibility that it was absent in his sources. Another source, Clement, of Alexandria. This is around 200 CE. Now he suggests in his Stromata, chapter 1 and verse 21, that Jesus preached for a little over a year, aligning his ministry with the acceptable year of the Lord from Isaiah chapter 61. Now we're going to cover that in some depth a little bit later on. Origen, some 50 years later, 250 CE. See, when referencing John 6:4, does not mention the Passover, which some interpret as an indication that his manuscript may have lacked this verse, or certainly the Passover part of it. He leaned more towards a shorter ministry, though he recognized differences between the gospel accounts. Then, of course, we come to Eusebius, 325 CE, or around there. Now, he was the first major church historian. And of course, as we have seen in his ecclesiastical history, he affirms 3 years, citing John's Passovers, but again, not specifically mentioning John 6 and verse 4. So the question remains as to why these early church writers don't specifically use John 6:4 in their deliberations. Now, we have to accept that these omissions are not definitive proof of the verse's absence, as they could be due to, selective citation, or, as some scholars phrase it, thematic focus, focusing on another subject which brings this thing into that narrative. But of course, the reality is that the majority of the extant Greek manuscripts do include John 6 verse 4. And this has led many scholars to consider it as an integral part of the gospel text. And some of these manuscripts are pretty famous ones. Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century manuscript. Primarily it's held in the British Library in London. The Codex Vaticanus, 4th century again. And this is held in the Vatican Library, in Vatican City, of course. Then you've got the Codex Alexandrinus. It's a 5th century manuscript. And this is held also in the British Library in London. However, you see, the presence of marginal markings such as the obelisk, this dagger in minuscule 472, indicates that some scribes were aware of debates regarding its authenticity. So, what are we to make of this? And why is this so important? Well, if John 6:4 is original, then as the scriptural evidence shows, which we've examined, Jesus did not travel to Jerusalem for that Passover. And if that is the case, he broke the law. And if that is the case, then he could not have fulfilled the law as he himself claimed in Matthew chapter 5 and verses 17 and 18, the Sermon on the Mount. This is how serious the matter is. See, if he did break the law, as the evidence around John 6 would indicate, then we would be compelled to conclude that Jesus was not the Messiah because he broke the law. And yet, that's how serious it is. The conclusion I'm personally drawing from this is, well, if John 6:4 is genuine, then Jesus could not be the Messiah. Do you think we need to look more closely at this subject, because I do. And so that's what I'm going to do in the next video. But in the meantime, please do your own research and check the scriptures yourself in order to let them inform you. Don't be informed by me. Let the scriptures inform you. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 21. We've covered this. I think it was in the introductory video way back a couple of months ago. So until next week, thank you once again for your attention, and see you then.